Hello and welcome to Module 7 in Anatomy 2. So we are going to discuss about the GIT, urinary tract, and male and female internal genital organs inside the pelvic cavity. At the end of this module, the students must be able to identify the sigmoid colon and the rectum, describe the position of the bladder and the pelvis in both full and empty states, and trace the courses of the male and female reproductive tracts. So what is the pelvic cavity? So this area is our pelvic cavity. So it is an area between the pelvic inlet and the pelvic outlet, as what we have discussed last module. So we have here the pelvic diaphragm. So our pelvic diaphragm here, which is located right here, is found between the pelvic cavity and then the perineum. So it means your pelvic diaphragm divides your pelvic cavity from your perineum. So what are its contents? So the lower ends of the intestinal and urinary tracts, the internal organs of reproduction, including their nerve and blood supply and lymphatic drainage. And as you can see in the picture, posteriorly, we can find the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the terminal coils of the ileum. And anteriorly, we have the urogenital organs. So let's start with the gastrointestinal tract. So again, in your pelvic cavity, we have the GIT, and the first one is your sigmoid colon. So our sigmoid colon is an S-shaped part of the large intestine, and its length reaches at about 10 to 15 inches or 25 to 38 centimeters. So it actually begins at the level of the left iliac crest in front of the pelvic brim. And actually, from here, it projects medially and terminates at the rectum at about the S3 or the third sacral vertebrae. So here is the difference between the male pelvis and then the female pelvis. Next, we have still part of the gastrointestinal tract is our rectum. So your rectum is a continuation of the sigmoid colon, of course, and it passes downward following the curve of the sacrum and the coccyx. Aside from that, it ends in front of the tip of the coccyx by piercing the pelvic diaphragm as it enters the perineum. And aside from that, it also follows the anterior concavity of the sacrum. It actually becomes continuous with the anal canal, and before bending downward and backward at its junction with the anal canal, again, it follows the anterior concavity of your sacrum. So as you see here, this is your rectum, this is the anal canal, and in the anal canal, we have the internal anal sphincter, which is again a smooth muscle. That's why it's involuntary. And we have here the external anal sphincter, which is voluntary since it's a skeletal muscle. And lastly, we have the anus here. So these are, we have the sigmoid colon and the rectum as parts of the pelvic cavity and also as parts of your gastrointestinal tract. Next, we have the urinary tract. So, from the collecting ducts, the urine drains into the minor calyces, which join to become major calyces that unite to form the renal pelvis. Now, from the renal pelvis, the urine first drains into the ureters and then into the urinary bladder. Urine is then discharged from the body through the single urethra. So the pelvic contents or components of the urinary tract are the ureters and the urinary bladder. The urethra has both pelvic and perineal parts, so note of that. So the first organ we have here is the ureters or the ureter. So its length reaches at about 25 to 30 centimeters or 10 to 12 inches. Its diameter is 1 millimeter to 10 millimeters, and they are actually thick-walled, narrow tubes that vary in diameter. It is considered also as a muscular tube from the kidney, and it actually are considered also retroperitoneal. And at the base of the urinary bladder, the ureters curve medially and pass obliquely through the wall of the posterior aspect of our urinary bladder. So take note that aside from that, it is actually located at the posterior surface of the bladder. So right here is a picture of the urinary bladder or the bladder. So in the floor of the urinary bladder is a small triangular area called the trigone, this one. So the two posterior corners of the trigone contain two ureteral openings, the opening into the urethra. The internal urethral orifice lies in the anterior corner. Because its mucosa is firmly bound to the muscularis, the trigone has a smooth appearance, also called the detrusor muscle. So this part is the detrusor muscle. This detrusor muscle consists of three layers of smooth muscle fibers, and around the opening to the urethra, the circular fibers form an internal urethral sphincter. Again, we have here the internal urethral sphincter. Inferior to it is the external urethral sphincter. We have it here. Let me get my pointer. We have it here, your external urethral sphincter, and then which is composed of skeletal muscle and is a modification of the deep muscles of the perineum. Again, we have the trigone here, the detrusor muscle, the internal urethral sphincter. Next is the external urethral sphincter. Now take note that your urinary bladder, both in males and females, they are actually situated immediately behind the pubic bones within the pelvis. But in males, it's actually located anterior to the rectum, and in females, it's located anterior to the vagina and inferior to the uterus. And it's actually smaller compared to the males. It is because the uterus occupies the space just superior to the urinary bladder. Next is the urine storage. So the maximum capacity of our urinary bladder is up about 500 ml. So it is considered as a hollow distensible muscular organ, and take note that this has a strong muscular wall, and the detrusor muscle gives that function. Next, if there is urine in the bladder, it actually forms a sphere, or as it is spherical shaped. But when the bladder is empty, it actually collapses or it forms a pyramidal shape. But if there is increase in urine volume inside the urinary bladder, it will now become pear-shaped. Folds of the peritoneum hold the urinary bladder in position. When slightly distended due to the accumulation of urine, the urinary bladder is spherical. When it is empty, it collapses, and as urine volume increases, it becomes pear-shaped and rises into the abdominal cavity. Next, its shape and relations vary according to the amount of urine that it contains, so take note of that. In the adult, the empty bladder lies entirely within the pelvis. As the bladder fills, its superior wall rises up into the hypogastric region. But in a young child, the empty bladder projects above the pelvic inlet. Later, when the pelvic cavity enlarges, the bladder sinks into the pelvis to take up the adult position. So next organ we have here is the urethra. So the urethra is a small tube leading from the internal urethral orifice in the floor of the urinary bladder to the exterior of the body. So that is our urethra. So that it is also the terminal portion of the urinary system and the passageway for discharging urine from the body. That's for both males and females. But specifically, in the male urethra, it actually discharges semen, fluid that contains sperm as well. It also extends from the internal urethral orifice to the exterior, but its length and passage through the body are considerably different than in females. And it also first passes through the prostate, then through the deep muscles of the perineum, and finally through the penis at a distance of about 20 centimeters or 8 inches. Aside from that, in the male urethra, we have here three anatomical regions. So the first one is the prostatic urethra. So this prostatic urethra passes through the prostate. So definitely it's self-explanatory. Next, the intermediate or the membranous urethra. So this one is considered as the shortest portion, and it passes through the deep muscles of the perineum. And lastly, we have the spongy urethra. So this one is the longest portion, and it passes through the penis. Next is the female urethra. So it lies directly posterior to the pubic symphysis, directed obliquely, inferiorly, and anteriorly, and its length is about 4 centimeters or 1.5 inch. And it has this external urethral orifice wherein it is an opening of the urethra to the exterior, and it is located between the clitoris and the vaginal opening. Next topic is the male internal genital organs. First one is the vas deferens or the ductus deferens. So that's its other name. So in this picture, we can find the vas deferens right here. Okay, this is our vas deferens. So it is a thick-walled tube about 18 inches or 45 centimeters long. It conveys mature sperm from the epididymis to the ejaculatory duct and the urethra. So take note of that. So from here, it will actually convey mature sperm. From the epididymis, it will convey mature sperm to the ejaculatory duct and then towards your urethra. Okay. Next, we have here, its terminal part is dilated to form the ampulla of vas deferens, and the inferior end of the ampulla narrows down and joins the duct of the seminal vesicle to form the ejaculatory duct. Next, we have the seminal vesicles. So the seminal vesicles are two lobulated organs about 2 inches or 5 centimeters long, lying on the base of the bladder. So if this is the base of the bladder, these are the seminal vesicles. So one on the right and one on the left. The terminal part of the vas deferens lays on the medial side of each vesicle. So again, this is the terminal part of the vas deferens. So they lay at the side of each seminal vesicle. So, posteriorly, your seminal vesicles are related to the rectum, but inferiorly, it narrows and joins the vas deferens of the same side, as you can see here on the picture, to form the ejaculatory ducts, one on the left and one on the right. So, they consist of much coiled tube embedded in connective tissue. So they function to produce a secretion that is added to the seminal fluid. The secretions nourish the spermatozoa, and during ejaculation, the seminal vesicles contract and expel their contents into the ejaculatory ducts, thus washing the spermatozoa out of the urethra. So that is the function of our seminal vesicles. Next, we have the ejaculatory duct. So each one is less than 1 inch and 2.5 centimeters long. They are formed by the union of the vas deferens, again here, and then the seminal vesicle on each side. So it pierces the posterior surface of the prostate and opens into the prostatic part of the urethra, close to the margin of the prostatic ventricle. So the function of our ejaculatory duct is to drain the seminal fluid into the prostatic urethra. Next, we have the prostate gland. So the prostate gland is a fibromuscular glandular organ that surrounds the prostatic urethra. So its length reaches about 1.25 inches or 3 centimeters long, and it lies between the neck of the bladder above and the urogenital diaphragm below. It is a fibrous capsule there is a fibrous capsule that surrounds the prostate, and the two ejaculatory ducts pierce the upper part of the posterior surface of the prostate to open to the prostatic urethra at the lateral margins of the prostatic ventricle. So take note that the somewhat conical prostate has a base which lies against the bladder, neck above, and an apex. So this is the base and the apex, which lies against the urogenital diaphragm